Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for part 4 of chapter 1. And we're going to talk a little bit about perspectives of psychology. So let's start here. Um, for the most part, there has been an argument about how many different perspectives there actually are of psychology. And it kind of is now set at about 9 different perspectives. So we're going to talk about each one of these, but I do want to emphasize, at some point in time as we're preparing for the AP exam, having a pretty good knowledge of these different perspectives can be very vital. A lot of your questions that you're going to have on the AP exam go back to having kind of an understanding of which psychologists come from these different perspectives and what these different perspectives are really all about. So, as we go along, make sure you take special note to the differences between these perspectives and some of the founders that go along with that. So, we're going to start with the biological view, and the biological view basically is searching for the cause of behavior in the functions of our genes, the brain, our nervous system, any of the biochemical side of our body. So we could be looking at the endocrine system and such, and our heredity. So, all these different things, for the most part, would probably explain behavior in some way or another. You could break this down and you could talk a little bit about things like neuroscience, okay, which is kind of a foundation, maybe not necessarily a founder, but neuroscience or biopsychology is devoted to how the brain creates thoughts and feelings and motives and consciousness when we're aware of things, memories or other mental processes, which get into things like problem solving and thinking. Um, Evolutionary psychology sees behavior and mental processes in terms of genetic adaptation. So, how are we adapting to our environment? It has a lot to do with natural selection. So, it's kind of rooted in Charles Darwin in a sense. Maybe he would be kind of a quasi founder of this kind of line of thinking. All right, let's talk about the developmental view. The developmental view, for the most part, emphasizes the changes that occur during our lifespan. So we're looking at womb to tomb as far as things are concerned. They look for kind of the fact that change is constant through our life, and change, for the most part, can result in the interaction of our heredity, but also with the environment. So when we were looking at this, it studies things like nature versus nurture. So how are we, uh, for the most part, created maybe in the genetic sense, but or how are we being raised as far as the environment is concerned? So the nature nurture side. And how we change as we age cognitively, how we think, problem solve, such socially. So when we talk about like guys like Eric Erickson, that he might be looking at the social side and the physicality, like how we are going to change as far as um, our brain development, even all the way to when we start talking about our golden years and we look at what might happen with things like dementia. All right. The cognition view or the cognitive view. Um, this is emphasizing mental processes like learning, memory, perception, thinking as forms of information processing. Our thoughts and actions arise from the ways that we interpret our experiences for the most part. So when we look at this cognition, that's thinking, memory, perception, sensation. Cognitive neurosciences is an emphasis on brain activity as information is being processed. All right. The psychodynamic view, or sometimes as it once was known as the psychoanalytic. Okay. This is kind of the emphasis of on understanding of mental disorders in terms of our unconscious mind. And our big founder here probably would be Sigmund Freud. Now, granted, there are other neo-Freudians that you could probably throw in here as well, but he is kind of the guy who is credited as being the founder. He practiced psychoanalysis, which is kind of the forerunner to the psychodynamic view. The humanistic view. When we look at the humanistic view, we're looking at it maybe in terms of emphasis on our ability, human ability, our willingness for growth, not necessarily in a physical sense, but growing maybe emotionally and relationship wise, our potential, and this concept of free will. So we're looking at things like the self concept, maybe self fulfillment. Our big founders here would be Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and Carl Rogers when we talk about like the positive self-image and the concept of group therapy. The behavioral view. This gets into talking about any source of action that is environmentally stimulating or stimuli, meaning that our actions are a result of our environment and not necessarily mental processes. Some of the founders, John B. Watson, he was looking at the cause of behavior in our biology, and he studied classical conditioning. We could also probably throw Ivan Pavlov on here, but Pavlov kind of stumbled upon this whole idea of behavioralism kind of by accident. B.F. Skinner, he was an operant psychologist, meaning that he studied operant conditioning. He used reinforcement, rewards, and punishments. The social cultural view. This is getting into talking about the emphasis on the importance of social interaction, social learning, a cultural perspective. This is a relatively new area. Because when we talk about culture, culture is not necessarily something that's fixed throughout the world. It does vary from, place to place. And it can be pretty complex because you can be looking at language and beliefs and customs and values and traditions of a variety of group of people, even within a political boundary, meaning like you can look at how culture kind of varies from geographic regions here in the United States. So anyway, this social cultural view, they look at the role of obedience and how that might influence our behaviors and our actions. They might also look at things like prejudice and how that kind of has stuck around for years and how it kind of perpetuates from generation to generation. The evolutionary and social biological view. This is also another area that's fairly new. They examine individual behavior through natural selection, and so they're kind of looking at kind of the lens of again Charles Darwin as far as genetics are concerned and natural selection. But they're looking at behavior as both adapted and hereditary. So, this might be an area where you would study not only humans, but you might study animals to kind of understand how people have adapted and evolved over time. Along with that area of thought, let's see if we can get this to work. There we go. Darwin, basically how species have adapted over time. He kind of gets credited. All right, last area is our trait view. This has a lot to do when we talk about personality. It views behavior and personality as a product of physiological characteristics. And these characteristics are enduring. They're kind of long lasting for the most part. You could be talking about things like introversion and extroversion, perhaps. But they look at personality characteristics in terms of the business world and education. So, like, what type of personality traits might be good with an individual who might want to be involved in sales? Or we could be looking at perhaps maybe how to get a student who's a little shy to become a little more outgoing within a classroom. All that would be something that they would look for. All right. The last area that we're going to talk about is getting into talking about psychology as a college major. And we're going to take a look at some different degrees that you can look at and maybe where that might play. So, we're going to talk about the PhD, the EDD, and the PsyD. And so, a PhD, for the most part, is a doctorate in philosophy. A lot of college professors have one of these, but an individual could be a counselor or a researcher, or kind of a clinical psychologist with that type of degree. An individual with an educational doctorate, which is basically a doctorate of education, the EDD. This is an individual who might be a school psychologist, or they might work with preparing uh, students to become teachers. And finally, the psychology doctorate. For the most part, this would be a person who might go into private practice, maybe an individual who might be involved in industrial organization psychology or an engineering psychologist. All these would be majors that could possibly be within the field of psychology. And depending on what the person's wanting to do, it probably would help direct them into, which degree program that they would go after. All right, you have finished. Thank you very much.